Welcome to Sleep History Night. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was said to be a lush mountain of trees rising above the deserts of Mesopotamia. Yet no one has ever proven it existed. Tonight, we'll follow the clues, the ancient writings, and the lost cities behind one of history's greatest mysteries. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Do you think the Hanging Gardens were real? Or have we been chasing a legend for over 2,000 years? If you enjoy exploring history with us, please like, subscribe, and thank you for being here tonight. There are ancient mysteries that survive because the evidence is incomplete. And then there are mysteries that survive because the evidence seems to disappear altogether. The Hanging Gardens belong to the second category. For more than 2,000 years, they have occupied a strange place in human memory, standing at the crossroads of history, legend, archaeology, and imagination. Millions of people have heard their name. Countless books have described them. They appear in classrooms, documentaries, museums, and lists of the greatest achievements of the ancient world. Yet if someone were to ask a surprisingly simple question, where exactly are the remains of the Hanging Gardens? The answer becomes far less certain than most people expect. This is the puzzle that has fascinated historians for generations. We are not talking about a forgotten village, a lost tomb, or a minor structure mentioned once in an obscure text. We are talking about one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a monument supposedly so extraordinary that ancient writers placed it alongside the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure that still towers above the Egyptian desert today. And yet, while the pyramid remains visible to anyone who wishes to see it, the Hanging Gardens seem to exist in an entirely different way. They survive vividly in stories, but far less clearly in stone. To appreciate how unusual this is, it helps to imagine the world in which the legend emerged. Long before modern nations existed, before airplanes crossed oceans, before satellites mapped every corner of the planet, information traveled slowly. Stories moved from traveler to traveler, merchant to merchant, kingdom to kingdom. Some stories faded. Others grew larger with every retelling. The greatest cities of antiquity became surrounded by an almost mythical aura. People who never visited them still spoke about them. Their names carried power. Their reputations traveled farther than their armies. Among those cities, few inspired more fascination than Babylon. Situated in ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Babylon became one of the most famous urban centers of the ancient world. To later generations, it represented wealth, engineering, royal ambition, and the astonishing ability of human beings to reshape their environment. The city's walls were said to be immense. Its temples rose above the plains. Its rulers commanded resources that few kingdoms could match. In many ways, Babylon already seemed larger than life, which may explain why stories of a magnificent artificial garden growing high above the earth found such fertile ground in the imagination. According to ancient descriptions, the Hanging Gardens were unlike anything most people had ever seen. They were not simply gardens in the ordinary sense. They were described as a series of elevated terraces stacked one above another, covered with trees, shrubs, flowers, and flowing water. Some accounts suggest that visitors approaching the structure would have seen what looked like a green mountain rising unexpectedly from the flat landscape of Mesopotamia. Massive trees supposedly grew on upper levels. Water somehow reached heights that nature itself would not easily allow. Shade and vegetation flourished where one might expect only heat and dust. Even today, the image remains powerful. It is easy to understand why ancient observers were captivated by the idea. Yet this is precisely where the mystery begins. The more impressive a structure becomes in the historical record, the more one expects to find evidence supporting its existence. Massive projects leave marks on the landscape. They require labor, materials, planning, administration, and maintenance. They generate records. They influence surrounding communities. They become difficult to hide from history. This is why the Hanging Gardens create such an unusual problem. Despite their fame, direct evidence remains surprisingly elusive. Historians have spent decades wrestling with a question that appears almost contradictory. How can one of the most celebrated wonders in human history leave behind so little certainty? Part of the answer lies in the nature of ancient sources themselves. Most people assume that ancient writers who described famous wonders must have witnessed them personally. In reality, history is often more complicated. Many ancient authors relied on earlier texts, traveler reports, official records, oral traditions, or information gathered from multiple sources. Sometimes these methods preserved valuable truths. Sometimes they introduced errors. Sometimes they did both at the same time. The Hanging Gardens sit directly within that uncertainty. Ancient authors describe them with confidence, yet the chain connecting those descriptions to first-hand observation is often difficult to reconstruct. This does not mean the stories are false. It simply means that historians must approach them with caution. Every detail must be examined. Every claim must be weighed against the evidence. Every assumption must be tested. The challenge becomes even more intriguing when archaeology enters the story. Beginning in the 19th century, archaeologists started uncovering ancient Mesopotamia on a scale never before possible. Cities that had vanished beneath layers of earth gradually reappeared. Forgotten inscriptions emerged from the ground. Entire chapters of ancient history suddenly became accessible. It seemed only a matter of time before the mystery of the Hanging Gardens would be solved. Many researchers believed the answer was waiting beneath the ruins of Babylon itself. Excavations revealed impressive structures. Palace complexes appeared. Defensive walls emerged. Administrative buildings, temples, and royal inscriptions helped reconstruct the world of ancient kings. Yet despite these remarkable discoveries, the expected evidence for the Hanging Gardens remained frustratingly difficult to identify. The absence became increasingly significant. Each new excavation answered some questions while creating others. Researchers found themselves confronting a possibility that felt almost paradoxical. What if one of the most famous wonders in history had left no clearly identifiable remains? Such a possibility challenges our assumptions about how historical memory works. We often imagine that fame follows evidence. In reality, fame sometimes follows stories. A narrative can become so compelling, so widely repeated, and so deeply woven into cultural memory that it acquires a life of its own. Over centuries, the distinction between what is documented, what is believed, and what is assumed can become surprisingly difficult to separate. The Hanging Gardens may represent one of the greatest examples of this process in all of ancient history. Yet dismissing them as mere legend would be equally premature. History offers many examples of discoveries that seemed impossible until new evidence emerged. Entire civilizations were once dismissed as myths before archaeologists uncovered their cities. Ancient texts once regarded as unreliable have occasionally proven astonishingly accurate. The lesson is not that every legend is true. The lesson is that uncertainty should inspire investigation rather than conclusions. This is what makes the Hanging Gardens such a compelling subject. They exist in a space where certainty remains elusive, but possibility refuses to disappear. Every generation of scholars arrives at the mystery, believing it may finally provide a definitive answer. Every generation leaves with new insights, but also new questions. Some researchers believe the gardens genuinely existed in Babylon and that their remains simply have not been identified beyond reasonable doubt. Others suspect that later writers misunderstood earlier sources. Some propose that the gardens existed but not in Babylon at all. Still others suggest that multiple traditions may have merged over time, creating a story more complex than anyone initially realized. What makes these possibilities fascinating is that each one contains elements supported by evidence. None can be dismissed entirely. None has achieved universal acceptance. The result is a historical puzzle that remains alive in a way few ancient mysteries do. Instead of narrowing toward certainty, the investigation often expands into new territory. Every answer seems to reveal another layer beneath it. And perhaps that is why the Hanging Gardens continue to capture attention after more than 2 millennia. They force us to confront the limits of what we know about the ancient world. They remind us that even the most famous stories can contain unanswered questions. They demonstrate that history is not simply a collection of established facts, but an ongoing search for understanding. Somewhere in that search lies the truth about the Hanging Gardens. Perhaps the terraces once rose above the skyline of a great city. Perhaps their true location has been misunderstood. Perhaps fragments of the story survive in places historians have only begun to investigate. Whatever the answer may be, one fact is already clear. Before we can determine whether the Hanging Gardens truly existed, we must first understand how they became one of the most celebrated wonders in human history. Because sometimes the most revealing part of a mystery is not the solution itself, but the remarkable journey that transformed an ancient story into a question that still refuses to disappear. By the middle of the 19th century, the mystery had acquired a new kind of momentum. For centuries, Babylon had existed in an unusual state, somewhere between history and imagination. Scholars knew the city had once been real. Ancient texts spoke of it repeatedly. Classical writers described its grandeur. Religious traditions preserved its memory. Yet no traveler could point to a living Babylon. No visitor could walk its streets. No king ruled from its palaces. The city that had once dominated the imagination of the ancient world seemed to have dissolved into the landscape of Mesopotamia itself. Across the broad plains of modern Iraq, countless mounds of earth rose from the horizon. To local communities, many appeared unremarkable. To European explorers arriving with copies of ancient texts in their luggage, however, those mounds represented possibilities. Somewhere beneath the dust and sun-baked soil might lie the remains of cities that had shaped human civilization. Somewhere beneath those silent hills could rest the answer to questions that had lingered for thousands of years. The search for Babylon did not begin with certainty. It began with fragments. Travelers moving through Ottoman territories reported unusual ruins. Broken bricks bearing strange inscriptions appeared across the landscape. Massive earthen mounds stretched across the plains in patterns too regular to be entirely natural. The clues were scattered, incomplete, and often misunderstood. Early explorers frequently found themselves caught between observation and expectation. Many arrived hoping to confirm stories they already believed. Some interpreted every ruin through the lens of biblical narratives. Others viewed Mesopotamia as a stage upon which the ancient world had once performed its greatest dramas. Yet beneath the speculation, genuine discoveries were beginning to emerge. As archaeology slowly transformed from treasure hunting into a scientific discipline, investigators started approaching these ancient sites with new methods and greater discipline. One of the most important figures in this story was the British explorer and diplomat Austen Henry Layard. Although Layard became most famous for excavating Assyrian sites such as Nineveh, his work helped demonstrate something profoundly important. The ancient civilizations described in texts were not merely literary inventions. Entire cities still existed beneath the ground, waiting to be uncovered. Monumental palaces emerged from the earth. Winged stone guardians appeared after centuries of burial. Thousands of inscribed tablets offered direct voices from antiquity. Every discovery reinforced a growing realization that Mesopotamia was far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined. The success of these excavations fueled a wider search across the region. If Nineveh could emerge from beneath the dust, perhaps Babylon could as well. As interest intensified, archaeologists and scholars increasingly focused their attention on a site near the modern town of Hilla, south of Baghdad. The landscape itself did not immediately inspire visions of one of history's greatest cities. There were no towering walls visible from afar. No magnificent temples dominated the horizon. Instead, there were broad mounds of earth, broken bricks scattered across the ground, and traces of structures whose significance was not immediately obvious. Yet beneath that quiet surface lay centuries of accumulated history. The challenge was not finding ruins. The challenge was understanding them. The man who would become most closely associated with this effort was a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey. When he arrived in the late 19th century, archaeology was entering a new phase. Earlier generations had often focused on spectacular discoveries. Koldewey brought a more systematic approach. He believed that careful excavation, precise recording, and patient analysis could reveal far more than dramatic artifacts alone. Beginning in 1899, he launched what would become one of the most ambitious archaeological projects of its time. For nearly 2 decades, his team worked at Babylon, gradually exposing layers of the ancient city hidden beneath centuries of debris. The scale of the undertaking was immense. Thousands of workers removed enormous quantities of soil. Trenches stretched across the landscape. Foundations emerged, streets reappeared, walls began to take shape. What had once seemed like little more than a collection of dusty mounds slowly transformed into a recognizable city. For the first time in centuries, parts of Babylon were returning to the light. The discoveries were remarkable. Archaeologists uncovered sections of the famous processional way, a ceremonial route that once guided visitors through the heart of the city. They found traces of the Ishtar Gate, one of the most celebrated architectural achievements of the ancient world. Decorated with brilliant glazed bricks and images of lions, dragons, and bulls, the gate provided tangible evidence of Babylon's former splendor. Palaces emerged from beneath the earth. Defensive walls revealed the immense scale of the city's construction efforts. Administrative buildings and inscriptions offered insight into the organization of imperial power. With every season of excavation, Babylon appeared less like legend and more like a place inhabited by real people pursuing real ambitions. Yet amid this growing success, one question remained unanswered. Where were the hanging gardens? The expectation seemed reasonable. If ancient descriptions were accurate, the gardens would have represented one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of their era. Such a structure should have left traces. Foundations, irrigation systems, retaining walls, or architectural remains might reasonably be expected to survive. The problem was that no discovery fit the descriptions perfectly. Koldewey himself believed he may have found a clue. During excavations near the southern part of the palace complex, he uncovered a structure unlike others at the site. It featured unusually thick walls and a series of vaulted chambers constructed from stone. This immediately attracted attention, because stone was relatively uncommon in Babylonian architecture. Even more intriguing, nearby evidence suggested the possibility of water-related engineering. To Koldewey, the combination seemed promising. Perhaps these remains belonged to the legendary gardens. Perhaps the vaulted chambers had supported elevated terraces. Perhaps machinery once lifted water upward to nourish vegetation growing above. It was an exciting hypothesis, and for a time, it gained considerable support. Yet archaeology has a habit of rewarding patience and skepticism in equal measure. As additional evidence emerged and scholars re-examined the site, doubts began to appear. The structure's location did not align comfortably with some ancient descriptions. Alternative interpretations seemed plausible. What initially looked like evidence for a wonder might instead represent storage facilities, military infrastructure, or another type of administrative building. The more closely researchers examined the remains, the less certain the identification became. This uncertainty did not mean Koldewey was wrong. It simply illustrated a recurring challenge in archaeology. Physical evidence rarely arrives with labels attached. Ruins do not announce their purpose. Historians must reconstruct meanings from fragments, patterns, and probabilities. Sometimes the evidence supports a clear conclusion. Other times, it leaves room for competing interpretations. The search for the hanging gardens increasingly belonged to the second category. What makes this period particularly fascinating is how expectations shaped the investigation. Archaeologists arrived looking for a wonder already famous in literature. They knew what they hoped to find. They knew the stories. They knew the descriptions. Yet history does not always cooperate with expectation. Sometimes discoveries confirm traditional narratives. Sometimes they complicate them. And sometimes they point in entirely unexpected directions. Babylon was providing extraordinary evidence for many aspects of ancient history. But the gardens remained elusive. The absence gradually became a clue in its own right. Researchers began asking whether they had framed the question correctly from the beginning. What if the gardens existed, but had been altered beyond recognition? What if later construction had destroyed critical evidence? What if ancient descriptions contained exaggerations? Or, more provocatively, what if archaeologists were searching for the right wonder in the wrong place? Such questions would have seemed radical to earlier generations, yet they emerged naturally from the evidence itself. The more archaeology revealed about Babylon, the more complex the mystery became. The city unquestionably existed. Its power was real. Its rulers were real. Its monumental architecture was real. Yet, the specific wonder that had captured imaginations for centuries remained strangely absent. This created an unusual situation. Archaeology was simultaneously solving and deepening the mystery. Every new discovery illuminated ancient Babylon while making the Hanging Gardens harder to explain. By the early 20th century, investigators had transformed our understanding of Mesopotamia. Entire civilizations had re-entered history. Forgotten languages were deciphered. Kings whose names had vanished for millennia once again became known. Yet one of antiquity's most famous wonders remained stubbornly beyond reach. The search had uncovered magnificent gates, royal palaces, inscriptions, roads, temples, and walls. It had revealed a city worthy of its legendary reputation. But the gardens themselves seemed to retreat further into uncertainty with every attempt to define them. And perhaps that was the most surprising discovery of all. The archaeologists who went looking for Babylon succeeded beyond almost anyone's expectations. They found a city that had once stood at the center of the ancient world. They restored lost chapters of human history. They proved that legends sometimes rest upon solid foundations. Yet in the process, they encountered a mystery that refused to behave like an ordinary archaeological problem. Instead of becoming clearer, it became more intriguing. The city had been found, the evidence was emerging, the investigation was advancing, and still the question remained, waiting beneath the surface, as compelling as ever. If the Hanging Gardens truly existed, why were they proving so difficult to find? To understand why so many people believed the Hanging Gardens could have existed, it is necessary to step away from the mystery for a moment and enter the world that supposedly produced it. The question is not simply whether the gardens were real. An equally important question is whether Babylon itself possessed the wealth, technology, ambition, and organizational power required to create such a wonder. The answer begins nearly 26 centuries ago, when the city stood at the center of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. Imagine approaching Babylon during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC. Long before the city comes into view, signs of civilization begin to appear across the landscape. Irrigation canals branch away from the Euphrates River like arteries carrying life into the surrounding plains. Farmers work fields of barley and dates. Boats move along waterways, transporting goods toward the city. Caravans approach from distant regions, carrying timber, metals, stone, spices, and textiles. Everything seems to flow toward a single destination. Then, gradually, the horizon begins to change. Massive walls emerge from the distance. Towers rise above the flat Mesopotamian plain. The closer a traveler moves toward Babylon, the more difficult it becomes to ignore the scale of what human beings have created. Ancient writers often described Babylon with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Their numbers may not always be accurate by modern standards, but their reactions reveal something important. They saw a city that appeared larger, richer, and more ambitious than almost anything they had encountered before. This was not merely a political capital, it was a statement of power expressed through architecture. Every wall, gate, temple, and processional route communicated the same message. Babylon intended to impress. It intended to dominate. It intended to endure. At the heart of this transformation stood Nebuchadnezzar II, one of the most significant rulers in Mesopotamian history. When modern audiences hear his name, they often associate him with biblical narratives, but from a historical perspective, his greatest achievement may have been architectural rather than military. During his reign, Babylon underwent a massive building program unlike anything the city had previously experienced. Royal inscriptions repeatedly emphasize construction projects. Temples were restored, defensive systems were expanded, palaces were enlarged, roads were improved, public spaces were redesigned. Nebuchadnezzar did not simply govern Babylon, he reshaped it. The surviving inscriptions reveal a ruler deeply concerned with leaving a visible legacy. Again and again, he describes rebuilding structures larger, stronger, and more magnificent than before. In many ways, the city became a monument to royal ambition. Perhaps nowhere was this ambition more visible than the famous Ishtar Gate. Today, fragments of the gate survive in museums, allowing modern observers to glimpse what ancient visitors once experienced. Covered in brilliant blue-glazed bricks, the structure must have appeared almost unreal beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Rows of lions, dragons, and bulls marched across its surface. The colors alone would have distinguished it from ordinary architecture. Most ancient cities were dominated by earth tones, stone, and mud brick. Babylon introduced vivid blue into the urban landscape on a monumental scale. For someone approaching the city for the first time, the visual impact would have been extraordinary. Passing through the Ishtar Gate led travelers onto the processional way, one of the ceremonial arteries of Babylon. During major festivals, religious processions moved along this route toward the city's sacred precincts. The road itself was carefully designed to reinforce the city's grandeur. Decorative walls lined portions of the route. Religious symbolism appeared throughout the architecture. The experience was not accidental, it was carefully choreographed. Every step reminded visitors that they were entering a place of exceptional importance. Beyond the processional way rose one of the most sacred structures in Mesopotamia, the great temple complex dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. Religion and political authority were deeply intertwined in the ancient Near East. Kings ruled not only through military power, but also through their relationship with the divine order. Maintaining temples, sponsoring rituals, and demonstrating devotion to the gods formed part of royal legitimacy. Babylon's religious architecture therefore served both spiritual and political functions. The city's temples communicated stability, continuity, and divine favor. They linked the king's authority to cosmic order itself. Towering above much of the city may have been the great ziggurat known as Etemenanki, a massive stepped structure that later traditions may have associated with the story of the Tower of Babel. Although many details remain debated, surviving evidence suggests that it was among the largest religious monuments of its kind. Rising layer upon layer toward the sky, It embodied a recurring theme in Mesopotamian architecture: the desire to bridge earth and heaven through monumental construction. This is a crucial detail when considering the possibility of the Hanging Gardens. Babylonian rulers were not strangers to ambitious engineering projects. Their civilization had spent centuries manipulating water, reshaping landscapes, constructing artificial elevations, and organizing labor on a vast scale. The concept of creating something that appeared to challenge nature itself would not have seemed absurd within this cultural context. Water management in particular deserves attention. Mesopotamia was both blessed and challenged by its rivers. The Euphrates and Tigris provided opportunities for agriculture, transportation, and trade, but they also demanded careful control. Over generations, Mesopotamian societies developed sophisticated systems of canals, reservoirs, embankments, and irrigation networks. Managing water was not a secondary activity. It was one of the foundations upon which urban civilization rested. Entire regions depended on the successful movement and distribution of water. Administrators monitored canals. Laborers maintained infrastructure. Engineers solved practical problems on a massive scale. This expertise helps explain why later descriptions of elevated gardens supplied by artificial irrigation did not immediately strike ancient audiences as impossible. Babylon already possessed a long tradition of hydraulic engineering. The question was never whether Babylonians understood water management. The question was whether they had pushed those capabilities to an unprecedented level. The city's economic resources also played a significant role. Babylon occupied a strategic position within broader trade networks connecting different regions of the ancient world. Goods flowed into the city from across the Near East. Timber arrived from distant forests. Precious metals moved through commercial routes. Luxury items circulated among elites. Agricultural production supported large populations. Wealth accumulated not only through conquest, but through commerce. This concentration of resources enabled large-scale projects that would have been impossible elsewhere. When historians evaluate claims about ancient wonders, economic capacity matters. Grand visions require material support. Babylon possessed that support. Yet the city's greatness was not solely a matter of wealth or architecture. It also reflected a particular mindset. Again and again, the surviving evidence suggests a civilization deeply invested in demonstrating order over chaos. Mesopotamia's environment could be harsh and unpredictable. Rivers flooded. Droughts threatened crops. Political rivals competed for power. Against this backdrop, monumental architecture represented more than beauty. It symbolized control. Cities imposed structure upon the landscape. Canals directed water where nature might not send it. Walls defined boundaries. Temples connected human society to divine stability. In this context, the image of an artificial mountain covered with vegetation acquires additional significance. Such a project would not merely display wealth, it would symbolize humanity's ability to transform its environment through knowledge, organization, and determination. Whether or not the Hanging Gardens existed exactly as later writers described them, the concept itself fits surprisingly well within Babylon's broader cultural ambitions. This does not prove the gardens were real. Historical caution remains essential. Yet, understanding Babylon at its height changes the nature of the discussion. The city was not some minor settlement incapable of extraordinary achievements. It was one of the greatest urban centers of its age. It commanded immense resources. It possessed advanced engineering traditions. It was led by rulers obsessed with monumental construction. If there was any place in the ancient world capable of creating something astonishing enough to inspire centuries of stories, Babylon belongs near the top of the list. And this realization introduces a new layer to the mystery. The more we learn about Babylon's power, wealth, and ambition, the easier it becomes to imagine the hanging gardens existing there. Yet the same evidence creates an uncomfortable contradiction. If the city truly possessed the capacity to build such a wonder, why does the archaeological record remain so uncertain? Why do the gardens appear so vividly in later descriptions, yet remain so difficult to identify among the ruins? The city itself demonstrates that extraordinary achievements were possible. The question is whether one particular achievement crossed the boundary from possibility into reality. Somewhere within the grandeur of Babylon, hidden among palaces, temples, canals, and royal inscriptions, that answer may still be waiting. If the Hanging Gardens truly existed, then the most important witnesses are not archaeologists, kings, or modern historians. They are the ancient writers whose words carried the gardens across centuries. Without them, the wonder would likely have vanished from memory long ago. No traveler today would search for it. No historian would debate it. No mystery would exist. Everything begins with the people who described the gardens and preserved their image for future generations. Yet the moment we begin examining those witnesses, the story becomes far more complicated than it first appears. One might naturally assume that the ancient descriptions come directly from people who stood before the gardens, walked among their terraces, and recorded what they saw with their own eyes. In reality, the chain of evidence is far less straightforward. Most of the surviving descriptions come from Greek and Greco-Roman writers who lived long after Babylon's political greatness had faded. Some wrote centuries after the gardens were supposedly constructed. Others relied on earlier sources that have since disappeared. As a result, we find ourselves in a curious position. The gardens are among the most vividly described monuments of antiquity, yet the people describing them often stand at a surprising distance from the events themselves. This does not automatically make their accounts unreliable. Ancient historians frequently preserved valuable information from earlier records that no longer survive. But it does mean that every detail deserves careful attention. Like investigators reconstructing a crime from old witness statements, we must examine not only what these writers said, but how they may have known it. One of the most influential descriptions comes from the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who lived during the 1st century BC. Writing hundreds of years after the Neo-Babylonian Empire had disappeared, Diodorus offered a remarkably detailed portrait of the gardens. According to his account, the structure consisted of ascending terraces that rose step by step like a theater. The upper levels supported deep layers of soil capable of sustaining large trees. Water was supposedly lifted continuously from the river below, allowing vegetation to flourish high above the surrounding landscape. The image is striking because it immediately transforms the gardens from a simple collection of plants into an engineering marvel. Diodorus was not describing decorative flower beds. He was describing an artificial landscape, a man-made mountain covered in living greenery. His account contains details that sound surprisingly practical. He speaks of stone supports, waterproof construction methods, and sophisticated irrigation. These elements have led some scholars to wonder whether Diodorus may have been drawing upon genuine technical descriptions that originated much closer to the period in question. At the same time, his narrative raises obvious questions. Where did these details come from? Was he preserving accurate information from an earlier source, or was he repeating a story that had already been embellished through generations of retelling? The answer remains uncertain. Yet Diodorus is only one voice among several. Another important witness is the geographer Strabo, whose writings provide a somewhat different perspective. Strabo lived during the transition between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Like Diodorus, he describes elevated gardens sustained through artificial irrigation. His account emphasizes the mechanical challenge of raising water upward. The detail may seem minor at first, but it reveals something important about how ancient observers understood the wonder. Their fascination was not limited to beauty. They were equally impressed by the technological achievement behind it. To a civilization deeply familiar with the difficulty of moving water, the idea of maintaining large trees on elevated terraces represented a remarkable accomplishment. Strabo's emphasis suggests that engineering may have been as central to the legend as the vegetation itself. The gardens were admired not simply because they were beautiful, but because they appeared to accomplish something nature would not normally allow. A third voice enters the story through Quintus Curtius Rufus, whose account was written during the Roman era. Curtius focused on Babylon during the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and his descriptions contributed significantly to later perceptions of the city. He portrays the gardens as a structure of immense visual impact, a place where dense vegetation seemed to float above the earth itself. His language is often more dramatic than technical, emphasizing wonder and spectacle. This difference is revealing. While Diodorus and Strabo sometimes sound like observers attempting to explain how the gardens functioned, Curtius often sounds more interested in how they felt. The distinction matters because it reminds us that ancient writers were not modern archaeologists. Their goals varied. Some sought geographical accuracy, others emphasized moral lessons, political themes, or literary beauty. Their descriptions therefore blend observation, interpretation, and storytelling in ways that can be difficult to separate. Another figure frequently associated with the gardens is Philo of Byzantium. Although many details surrounding his work remain debated, his discussion of the 7 wonders contributed significantly to the garden's legendary status. What stands out in Philo's treatment is the sense of astonishment. He presents the gardens as something almost unnatural, a place where agriculture seemed suspended in midair. Trees grew where trees should not grow. Water flowed where water should not easily reach. Human ingenuity appeared to overcome ordinary limitations. Reading these descriptions today, it becomes easier to understand why the gardens captured imaginations across the Mediterranean world. They represented more than luxury. They symbolized mastery over nature itself. Yet when we place all these accounts side by side, something intriguing emerges. Despite differences in style and emphasis, several core themes repeatedly appear. Nearly every description speaks of elevated terraces. Nearly every account mentions abundant vegetation. Most refer to sophisticated irrigation systems. The gardens are consistently portrayed as both beautiful and technologically impressive. This level of agreement has often been cited as evidence that the writers were drawing from a common tradition rooted in something real. Independent inventions tend to diverge dramatically. Shared details sometimes suggest a common source. However, this observation immediately creates another mystery. If the writers were drawing from a common source, what was that source? Here we encounter one of the greatest frustrations in ancient history. Many earlier works have been lost. Entire libraries disappeared through war, neglect, and the passage of time. Historians often know that certain texts existed without having access to them. Some scholars believe the surviving descriptions may ultimately trace back to accounts written by individuals closer to Babylon's Golden Age. If so, the original testimony has vanished, while later echoes survived. Others argue that repeated copying may have amplified errors. Once a compelling description entered circulation, subsequent writers may have accepted it without independently verifying every detail. Both possibilities remain plausible. This uncertainty becomes even more significant when we consider what is missing from the record. None of the surviving Greek descriptions can be confidently traced to a first-hand eyewitness who unquestionably stood before the gardens. The writers describe the wonder with conviction, yet the direct observational link remains frustratingly elusive. In historical investigations, proximity matters. A witness standing at the scene generally carries more weight than someone recounting a story centuries later. The Hanging Gardens force us to work largely with the latter category. This does not invalidate the evidence. It simply requires caution. The accounts remain valuable, but they cannot automatically be treated as definitive proof. What makes the situation particularly fascinating is that the Greek writers may have preserved more than factual information. They may also have preserved how ancient people thought about greatness itself. To Greek and Roman audiences, the gardens represented a vision of civilization at its most ambitious. They embodied wealth, technical skill, royal power, and the ability to reshape the environment according to human desire. In that sense, the descriptions function on multiple levels simultaneously. They are historical claims, literary narratives, and cultural symbols all at once. Untangling those layers is part of the challenge. And yet, despite every uncertainty, one fact remains difficult to ignore. Multiple ancient writers from different periods repeatedly describe a monumental garden associated with Babylon. Their details vary, but the central image persists with remarkable consistency. This persistence raises a question that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. If the gardens never existed in any form, why did such a specific tradition survive for so long? Conversely, if they did exist, why do the descriptions depend so heavily upon writers separated from the events by centuries? The Greek accounts illuminate the mystery, but they do not resolve it. Instead, they move the investigation into a new phase. They give us a vivid picture of what the gardens were believed to be. They reveal why the wonder captured imaginations across the ancient world. They provide clues, possibilities, and patterns. Yet they also expose the fragile foundation beneath much of the story. We possess descriptions. We possess admiration. We possess legends detailed enough to inspire confidence. What we still lack is certainty. And as the evidence continues to unfold, that gap between vivid description and firm proof becomes one of the most intriguing features of the entire mystery. Every historical mystery eventually reaches a moment when the evidence narrows to people. Not stones, not ruins, not artifacts. People. voices carried across centuries through ink and parchment, testimonies that survive long after the witnesses themselves have disappeared. In the case of the Hanging Gardens, this moment is especially important because the mystery increasingly depends on a deceptively simple question: who actually saw them? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Ancient writers described the gardens. Therefore, someone must have witnessed them. Yet the deeper historians investigate, the less straightforward that conclusion becomes. The problem is not that ancient sources are silent. The problem is that they speak with confidence while revealing surprisingly little about where their information originated. The result is a puzzle hidden inside a puzzle. Before determining whether the gardens existed, we must determine whether any surviving witness truly stood before them. Imagine for a moment that we are not studying ancient history, but investigating an event from the modern world. A famous building supposedly stood in a city. It was admired by generations. Books described it. Travelers spoke about it. Yet no photographs survived. No official blueprints could be found. No physical remains were clearly identified. Under such circumstances, investigators would naturally focus on eyewitnesses. Who actually saw the building? When did they see it? How detailed was their description? Could their account be independently verified? These are precisely the questions historians ask about the Hanging Gardens. The answers, however, lead into territory far more uncertain than many people expect. One of the earliest figures connected to the story is a man named Theseus. Theseus served at the Persian court during the late 5th century BC, several generations after Babylon reached its greatest prominence under Nebuchadnezzar II. Unlike many later writers, he spent years within the Persian Empire itself. This fact immediately makes historians pay attention. If valuable information about Babylon survived anywhere, Persian royal circles would be a logical place to find it. Theseus wrote a work known as the Persica, a history of Persia that unfortunately survives only in fragments quoted by later authors. Many scholars suspect that some of the earliest Greek traditions about the Hanging Gardens may ultimately trace back to him. Yet here the mystery deepens. We do not possess his original text. We know him largely through references preserved by others. Even more challenging, Theseus developed a reputation in antiquity for including dramatic stories that modern historians sometimes view with caution. Some of his descriptions appear accurate, others seem exaggerated. Determining where reality ends and embellishment begins remains difficult. He may have preserved authentic information. He may also have contributed to the growth of legend. The evidence refuses to settle comfortably on either side. Another figure frequently discussed is Berosus, who lived during the early Hellenistic period. Berosus occupies a unique position because he was not Greek by birth. He was a Babylonian priest writing in Greek, a man standing between two worlds. He understood the traditions of Mesopotamia while communicating them to audiences shaped by Greek culture. If anyone possessed access to genuine local knowledge about Babylon, Berosus seems an excellent candidate. Fragments of his writings suggest that he connected the gardens to Nebuchadnezzar II and described them as a royal project. This detail has influenced later interpretations enormously. Yet once again, the original work has not survived intact. Historians reconstruct his testimony through quotations preserved by later authors. It is one of the recurring frustrations of ancient history. The closer we move toward potentially valuable witnesses, the more fragmented the evidence becomes. We can glimpse their words, but rarely hear them directly. As the centuries passed, the story traveled farther from its possible origins. By the time writers such as Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Quintus Curtius Rufus recorded their descriptions, Babylon's golden age belonged to the distant past. Yet something fascinating occurred during this process. Rather than becoming less detailed, the accounts often became richer. The gardens grew increasingly vivid. Terraces appeared more elaborate. Irrigation systems became more impressive. Descriptions acquired a level of precision that almost feels eyewitness in nature. This creates an intriguing paradox. The farther the writers stand from the events, the clearer some details seem to become. Historians have long debated what this means. One possibility is that these later authors were drawing upon reliable earlier sources that have since vanished. Another is that generations of retelling gradually transformed a historical memory into a more polished narrative. Neither explanation fully resolves the issue. Both remain plausible. The challenge is determining how much historical reality lies beneath the literary surface. Perhaps the most interesting witness in this entire investigation is not a historian at all, but Alexander the Great. When Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BC, the city was still one of the most important urban centers in the Near East. He spent significant time there and even planned ambitious projects before his death. If the Hanging Gardens still existed during his lifetime, one might reasonably expect references from those who accompanied him. After all, Alexander's campaigns generated an enormous amount of historical writing. His generals, companions, and later biographers recorded details about cities, monuments, and landscapes across a vast empire. Yet the evidence remains surprisingly ambiguous. Later authors writing about Alexander describe Babylon's grandeur, but direct references to the gardens are far less clear than one might expect. This silence does not prove the gardens did not exist. Many ancient works have been lost. Important observations may simply have disappeared with them. Yet the absence remains noteworthy. A wonder so extraordinary should arguably have attracted attention from observers eager to describe remarkable sights. The fact that the evidence remains uncertain keeps the debate alive. As historians examine these ancient testimonies, another pattern emerges. The writers often appear genuinely impressed by the engineering challenges involved. Their fascination repeatedly returns to water. This detail matters because it feels less like fantasy and more like practical observation. Ancient readers understood how difficult it was to maintain large gardens in arid environments. They knew that raising water above ground level required effort, organization, and technical knowledge. The repeated emphasis on irrigation suggests that the gardens were admired not simply as beautiful scenery, but as a technological achievement. In some accounts, the engineering itself almost becomes the wonder. Such details have led certain scholars to argue that the descriptions may preserve memories of a real hydraulic system, even if other aspects of the story evolved over time. Yet every piece of supporting evidence seems accompanied by an equally compelling question. Why did the descriptions differ in important details? Why are dimensions inconsistent? Why do some accounts emphasize certain features while others focus elsewhere? These discrepancies are not unusual in ancient literature. Witnesses often disagree. Stories change as they travel. Memory itself is imperfect. Still, the variations remind us that we are dealing not with a single testimony, but with a collection of voices spread across centuries. Some may preserve accurate observations. Others may reflect assumptions inherited from earlier writers. Untangling these layers is one of the central challenges facing historians. There is also a broader cultural factor worth considering. Greek and Roman audiences loved stories about extraordinary places. Wonders occupied a special position in their imagination. They represented the limits of human achievement. They offered opportunities to explore themes of power, wealth, ingenuity, and ambition. A magnificent garden rising above the plains of Mesopotamia fit perfectly within that tradition. This does not mean the writers invented the gardens. It simply means they operated within a cultural environment that celebrated marvels. Their descriptions may therefore blend factual reporting with the literary expectations of their audiences. The distinction is subtle but important. Historical truth and narrative appeal are not mutually exclusive. A real structure can inspire dramatic storytelling. The challenge lies in determining where one ends and the other begins. As modern readers, we often assume that eyewitness testimony automatically settles historical questions. In reality, eyewitnesses can disagree, misremember, exaggerate, or misunderstand what they observe. The Hanging Gardens present an even more complex situation, because most surviving testimonies are filtered through layers of transmission. We are not simply evaluating witnesses, we are evaluating witnesses quoted by other witnesses, copied by scribes, translated across languages, and preserved through centuries of historical change. The process resembles looking through multiple panes of glass. Some details remain visible, others become distorted. Yet despite every uncertainty, one fact remains difficult to dismiss. The story persisted. Different writers, separated by time and geography, repeatedly returned to the image of elevated gardens associated with Babylon. The consistency of that core tradition suggests that something memorable stood behind it. Whether that something was the wonder, exactly as later generations imagined it, remains another matter entirely. This is where the mystery becomes most compelling. The ancient writers who claimed to know about the gardens do not provide certainty. They provide possibility. Their accounts neither prove nor disprove the existence of the wonder. Instead, they create a landscape of probabilities, clues, and unanswered questions. They invite us to consider that behind every legend there may be a historical reality, but also that historical realities can change shape as they pass through human memory. By the end of their testimony, we are left with an unusual conclusion. The witnesses are numerous enough to prevent dismissal, yet they are uncertain enough to prevent confidence. Their descriptions are detailed enough to inspire belief, yet their sources remain obscure enough to sustain doubt. And it is precisely within that tension that the Hanging Gardens continue to survive. Not as a solved historical fact, but as a mystery suspended between memory and evidence, waiting for the next clue to emerge from the shadows of the ancient world. At the center of the Hanging Gardens mystery lies a question that is often overshadowed by debates about archaeology and historical sources. It is a question so practical that it can easily be overlooked, yet it may hold the key to understanding whether the gardens were ever possible in the first place. Even if every ancient description were accurate, even if every terrace truly existed, even if great trees once rose above Babylon's skyline, there remains a fundamental challenge that cannot be ignored. How did the water get there? It is a deceptively simple question. Modern cities solve such problems with electric pumps, steel pipes, and vast infrastructure hidden beneath streets and buildings. Ancient engineers possessed none of these conveniences. They worked with stone, wood, bronze, rope, human labor, and an understanding of nature earned through centuries of observation and experimentation. If the Hanging Gardens existed as described, their greatest achievement may not have been the gardens themselves. Their greatest achievement may have been the invisible system that kept them alive. Imagine standing beneath a towering series of terraces rising above the Mesopotamian plain. The sun beats down from a cloudless sky. Temperatures climb relentlessly during the summer months. Trees spread their branches across elevated platforms. Shrubs and flowers fill every available space. Soil remains moist despite the surrounding heat. Water trickles through channels and disappears beneath dense vegetation. To a visitor, the greenery would be impressive. To an engineer, however, the greenery would represent a problem. Every leaf, branch, root, and flower demands water. Every day. Without constant irrigation, the entire spectacle would quickly begin to wither. This reality forces us to think differently about the gardens. Ancient writers often focused on their beauty, but beauty is only the visible surface of a much larger system. Hidden beneath the image of lush terraces lies a relentless logistical challenge. Water is heavy. Lifting it requires energy. Moving enough water to sustain mature trees requires enormous amounts of energy. Maintaining that flow day after day, season after season, year after year, requires organization on a scale that few ancient projects could match. The engineering challenge begins with simple physics and quickly grows into something extraordinary. Mesopotamia was not a mountainous region blessed with natural waterfalls feeding elevated landscapes. Babylon sat within a relatively flat river valley. The Euphrates provided abundant water, but abundance alone solves nothing if the water remains below the gardens. Somehow it had to be raised from the river to higher levels. Ancient descriptions repeatedly emphasize this feat because it was precisely the sort of accomplishment that impressed ancient observers. Anyone could admire flowers. Engineers admired the machinery hidden behind them. Historians today often approach the problem by working backward. Instead of asking whether the gardens existed, they ask what would have been required if they existed. The answers are surprisingly revealing. A structure capable of supporting mature trees would need deep layers of soil. Those soils would become extremely heavy when saturated with water. The terraces themselves would require tremendous structural strength. Retaining walls would need to withstand constant pressure from both earth and moisture. Waterproofing would become essential. Without it, water would gradually penetrate lower levels, weakening the structure and eventually causing collapse. Ancient writers occasionally mention layers of stone, bitumen, reeds, and lead used to prevent leakage. For many years, such descriptions seemed almost too technical to be believable. Yet modern archaeology has shown that Mesopotamian builders were remarkably skilled at controlling water. Bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum substance, was widely used throughout the region as a waterproofing material. The concept itself was entirely within Babylonian capabilities. In fact, the more researchers study ancient Mesopotamian engineering, the less implausible certain aspects of the gardens begin to appear. This does not prove the gardens existed. It simply means the underlying technology may have been more realistic than earlier generations assumed. The real challenge lies in the scale. Small irrigation systems were common throughout the ancient Near East. Entire civilizations depended on them. Large-scale vertical irrigation was something else entirely. To appreciate the difficulty, consider a single mature tree. Depending on species, climate, and season, one tree can require hundreds of gallons of water over time. Multiply that by dozens or perhaps hundreds of trees spread across multiple terraces, and the daily demand becomes enormous. Suddenly, the gardens cease to resemble a decorative project. They begin to resemble an industrial operation dedicated to moving water uphill. This realization has led historians to explore possible technologies that could have made such a system work. One frequently discussed possibility involves chain pumps. These devices use a continuous loop of rope fitted with containers or buckets. As the chain rotates, water is lifted upward from a lower source to a higher destination. Versions of this technology existed in various ancient cultures. Operated by human labor or animal power, chain pumps could theoretically raise significant quantities of water. Ancient descriptions of water being continuously elevated from the river align surprisingly well with this concept. Another possibility involves screw-based mechanisms. Many modern readers immediately think of the Archimedes screw, a device traditionally associated with the Greek mathematician Archimedes. The challenge is chronological. Archimedes lived centuries after the traditional period associated with Nebuchadnezzar II. Yet some researchers have suggested that similar principles may have existed earlier than commonly assumed. The evidence remains debated. No definitive proof places such a mechanism in Babylon during the 6th century BC. Nevertheless, the possibility illustrates how much remains unknown about ancient engineering. Technological innovation rarely emerges in a single moment. Ideas often develop gradually, appearing in forms that leave little archaeological evidence behind. Beyond the machinery itself lies another fascinating question: who operated it? Ancient wonders are often imagined as static monuments, but the Hanging Gardens, if real, would have functioned more like a living organism. Pumps require maintenance, channels require cleaning, water levels must be monitored. Plants must be cared for, dead vegetation must be replaced, soil must be managed. The gardens would have demanded a permanent workforce dedicated to keeping the system functioning. This introduces a social dimension often overlooked in popular discussions. The gardens would not simply represent an engineering achievement. They would represent an organizational achievement. Their survival would depend upon administrators, laborers, gardeners, engineers, and craftsmen working together over long periods of time. The wonder would not merely be the structure itself. The wonder would be the system sustaining it. As researchers explore these possibilities, another intriguing pattern emerges. Some aspects of the descriptions appear surprisingly practical, while others seem almost theatrical. Ancient writers often describe terraces that looked like mountains. They speak of greenery visible from great distances. They emphasize dramatic visual impact. Such details raise an important question. Were the gardens designed primarily for agriculture, comfort, prestige, or spectacle? The answer may influence how we interpret the entire mystery. If the project served primarily symbolic purposes, efficiency may have mattered less than appearance. Kings throughout history have invested vast resources in displays of power that made little practical sense. Palaces, monuments, and ceremonial architecture often exist not because they are efficient, but because they communicate authority. A mountain of greenery rising above an arid landscape would certainly communicate authority. It would demonstrate mastery over resources, labor, and nature itself. In this sense, the engineering challenge becomes part of the message. The difficulty is precisely what makes the achievement impressive. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the entire discussion is how modern engineering has gradually shifted scholarly opinion. Earlier generations sometimes dismissed the gardens because the descriptions sounded impossible. Contemporary researchers tend to be more cautious. Impossible is a dangerous word in archaeology. Human history repeatedly demonstrates that ancient societies were capable of far more than later generations expected. Massive pyramids, sophisticated irrigation systems, astronomical observatories, and monumental urban planning all remind us that technological capability does not always align neatly with modern assumptions. The Babylonians inherited centuries of engineering knowledge from earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. They managed rivers, constructed canals, built enormous walls, and organized large-scale public works. The question is no longer whether they possessed engineering skill. The question is whether they applied that skill to create something matching the descriptions that survived in later texts. And that distinction matters. It moves the discussion away from fantasy and toward probability. The gardens become less a question of magical impossibility and more a question of historical evidence. Could such a structure have existed? Increasingly, many researchers answer yes. Did such a structure exist? That remains far more difficult to establish. In a strange way, the engineering analysis deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. The more we understand about ancient technology, the more plausible the gardens begin to seem. Yet plausibility is not proof. Engineering demonstrates possibility. History demands evidence. Between those two realities lies the space where the Hanging Gardens continue to exist. Not as an obvious impossibility, not as a confirmed certainty, but as one of the most intriguing technological mysteries of the ancient world. And perhaps that is why the question refuses to disappear. Because if the gardens truly stood above Babylon, their greatest wonder may never have been the trees, the flowers, or the terraces. Their greatest wonder may have been the unseen machine hidden beneath them, quietly lifting life upward against gravity itself. Most historical mysteries become easier as evidence accumulates. Archaeologists uncover new ruins. Ancient texts are translated. Forgotten inscriptions emerge from the ground. Gradually, uncertainty begins to shrink. The mystery of the Hanging Gardens behaves differently. The more researchers learn about Babylon, the more one particular problem refuses to disappear. It is not a missing wall. It is not a lost artifact. It is not even the absence of a clearly identified ruin. The most disturbing clue is something far more unsettling. It is silence. Not the silence of modern deserts or abandoned archaeological sites, but the silence of the Babylonians themselves. Imagine discovering thousands upon thousands of official documents from one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Administrative records, economic accounts, construction reports, religious texts, royal inscriptions, letters, inventories, legal contracts, tax records, astronomical observations. Day after day, year after year, Babylonian scribes pressed information into wet clay, creating one of the largest surviving archives from antiquity. Entire generations devoted themselves to recording details that many modern people would consider trivial. They documented deliveries of grain, they tracked livestock, they listed workers, they measured land, they recorded temple activities and royal projects. In some cases, historians can reconstruct aspects of daily life with astonishing precision because the Babylonians were such meticulous record keepers. Yet when researchers search this enormous documentary landscape for clear references to the Hanging Gardens, they encounter something deeply unexpected. The wonder that later generations celebrated as one of the greatest achievements of the ancient world appears strangely absent. At first, this may not seem particularly alarming. Ancient evidence is incomplete. Many texts have been lost. Countless records disappeared through war, decay, and the passage of time. No historian expects a perfect archive. But the problem grows more significant the closer one looks. Babylonian kings loved to record their accomplishments. Royal inscriptions served both practical and political purposes. They documented construction projects while simultaneously promoting royal authority. A king who built a temple wanted future generations to know it. A king who repaired walls recorded the achievement. A king who expanded palaces often described the work in remarkable detail. Nebuchadnezzar II, in particular, left numerous inscriptions celebrating his building programs. He repeatedly emphasized his role as a creator, restorer, and patron of monumental architecture. His texts describe walls, gates, temples, roads, palaces, and religious structures. He wanted posterity to remember what he had built. This is what makes the silence surrounding the Hanging Gardens so difficult to ignore. If the gardens truly represented one of the most extraordinary construction projects of the age, why do they seem absent from the very records where historians would most expect to find them? The question becomes even sharper when one considers the nature of the project itself. According to later descriptions, the gardens were not minor decorative additions. They were massive architectural and engineering achievements requiring substantial resources, labor, planning, and maintenance. Such a project would fit perfectly within the type of accomplishment Babylonian rulers normally celebrated. Yet no surviving royal inscription clearly states, in unmistakable language, that Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens. Historians have searched for decades. They have examined inscriptions, translated tablets, and analyzed fragments. The result remains the same. There is no universally accepted Babylonian document that explicitly describes the wonder in the way later Greek and Roman writers do. This absence has led some scholars to view the silence as evidence against the gardens. Their reasoning follows a straightforward logic. If a ruler documented many lesser achievements, why omit perhaps his greatest one? If scribes recorded extensive details about construction projects throughout Babylon, why leave no clear reference to a wonder that later generations considered extraordinary? The argument is powerful because it appeals to common sense. Silence is not always meaningless. Sometimes silence itself becomes evidence. Yet history rarely rewards simple conclusions. The absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. Archaeologists repeat this caution frequently because the historical record is never complete. Entire archives have vanished. Countless documents remain undiscovered. Some survive only in fragments. Others were destroyed long ago. The fact that no known inscription explicitly describes the Hanging Gardens does not automatically prove they never existed. It simply means the evidence historians would most like to possess has not yet appeared. Between those two positions lies a vast territory of uncertainty. To understand why this matters, it helps to appreciate how much of Babylonian history has survived. Modern researchers possess tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia. These documents reveal details about economics, politics, religion, agriculture, astronomy, and daily life. Few ancient civilizations left such extensive written records. This abundance makes the absence of the gardens feel more significant than it might elsewhere. If we were dealing with a poorly documented society, missing references would be unsurprising. Babylon presents the opposite situation. The city speaks constantly about many subjects, yet remains strangely quiet about the one monument later generations remembered most vividly. Some scholars have proposed that the answer may lie in terminology. Perhaps the gardens existed but were described using language modern researchers do not immediately recognize. Ancient people may not have called them hanging gardens at all. That famous phrase originates from later traditions and may reflect translation choices rather than original terminology. If the structure existed under a different name, relevant references could remain hidden among texts already known but not yet correctly interpreted. This possibility cannot be dismissed. Ancient languages often contain nuances that are difficult to capture perfectly in translation. Words shift meaning across centuries. Descriptions that seem obvious in hindsight may not have appeared remarkable to contemporary observers. Another possibility involves the nature of royal inscriptions themselves. Modern audiences often assume these texts functioned like comprehensive reports. In reality, they were selective. Kings emphasized achievements that served political and religious goals. Certain projects received extensive attention, while others remained largely unmentioned. What modern historians view as important may not align perfectly with ancient priorities. It is conceivable that a garden, regardless of scale, did not occupy the same symbolic role as temples, walls, or religious monuments. Such an explanation remains speculative, but it reminds us that silence can emerge for many reasons. There is also a more intriguing possibility. What if the silence exists because historians have been asking the wrong question? What if the reason Babylonian records fail to describe the Hanging Gardens is not because the gardens never existed, but because they were never located in Babylon at all? At first glance, the idea sounds radical, yet it gains strength precisely because of the documentary problem. If researchers continue searching Babylonian records for references that never appear, perhaps the evidence belongs to another city entirely. This possibility would later inspire one of the most important alternative theories in the entire debate. For now, however, it remains only a possibility. The silence itself comes first. The alternative explanations emerge afterward. What makes this clue so unsettling is that it affects every other piece of evidence. The ancient descriptions become harder to evaluate. Archaeological discoveries become more ambiguous. Engineering possibilities become less decisive. The silence spreads across the entire investigation like a shadow. Every argument in favor of the gardens eventually encounters the same question. If they were truly one of Babylon's greatest achievements, why did the Babylonians themselves seem unwilling to talk about them? And yet, despite its power, the silence refuses to provide a definitive answer. Historical mysteries rarely end with a single clue. The absence of evidence can point in multiple directions. It may suggest a monument never existed. It may indicate records have been lost. It may reveal mistaken assumptions about location, terminology, or interpretation. Each possibility remains viable. None commands universal agreement. This is what makes the silence so fascinating. It is not merely a missing piece of information. It is an active force shaping the entire investigation. Every new theory must confront it. Every proposed solution must explain it. The mystery of the Hanging Gardens increasingly revolves around what is not present rather than what is. In many ways, this represents one of the most profound challenges in historical research. Historians are trained to work with evidence, but sometimes the most important clue is the evidence that should exist and does not. Such moments force researchers to think differently. Instead of asking what happened, they begin asking why certain traces failed to survive. The search becomes less about discovery and more about interpretation. By this stage of the investigation, the Hanging Gardens no longer resemble a conventional archaeological problem. They have become something more elusive. The ancient writers speak. The engineers offer possibilities. The ruins reveal fragments. Yet the people who supposedly built the wonder remain strangely quiet. Their silence echoes across centuries, growing louder with every unanswered question. And somewhere within that silence may lie the key to the entire mystery. Every great mystery reaches a moment when the evidence stops pointing forward and begins pointing sideways. Investigators spend years examining the same clues, revisiting the same locations, testing the same assumptions, only to discover that the real problem may not lie in the answers they have failed to find, but in the questions they have been asking all along. The story of the Hanging Gardens reaches precisely such a moment. For generations, scholars searched Babylon. They studied its ruins, translated its inscriptions, analyzed its architecture, and combed through every fragment of evidence they could uncover. Yet the gardens remained elusive. The archaeological proof never fully materialized. The Babylonian records remained strangely silent. The descriptions preserved by ancient writers continued to float above the evidence like a mirage that appeared convincing from a distance, but became harder to grasp the closer one approached. Then a possibility emerged that was at once shocking and strangely logical. What if the problem was not that the gardens had disappeared? What if the problem was that historians had been searching in the wrong city? At first glance, the idea sounds almost absurd. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are among the most famous landmarks in history. Their very name seems to settle the matter before it begins. Yet history has a habit of hiding its greatest surprises behind assumptions so familiar that few people think to question them. Names can mislead. Ancient sources can confuse locations. Political geography can shift. Conquerors can rename cities. Stories can migrate from one place to another over centuries of retelling. Once researchers began examining these possibilities seriously, a new and fascinating theory began to take shape. At the center of this intellectual turning point stands a British Assyriologist, Stephanie Dalley, whose work challenged one of the most deeply rooted assumptions in the entire debate. Rather than asking why Babylonian evidence for the gardens was so difficult to find, she asked a different question. What if the evidence existed, but belonged to another city entirely? It was a simple shift in perspective, yet its implications were enormous. Instead of treating the silence of Babylon as a frustrating obstacle, the theory treated it as a clue. Perhaps the reason Babylonian records failed to describe the gardens was not because the gardens never existed. Perhaps it was because they were never there in the first place. To understand how such a possibility could emerge, it is necessary to leave Babylon behind for a moment and travel northward into the heart of another great Mesopotamian empire. Long before Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into a symbol of royal grandeur, another civilization had dominated the region. The Assyrians built an empire of extraordinary military power. Their kings commanded vast armies, conquered distant territories, and constructed monumental capitals designed to project authority across the ancient Near East. Among those capitals stood a city whose name once inspired both admiration and fear: Nineveh. Today, Nineveh is often remembered through biblical stories and archaeological discoveries, but during its peak, it was one of the largest and most impressive cities in the world. Massive walls surrounded it. Palaces stretched across enormous complexes. Artisans decorated stone reliefs with scenes of warfare, hunting, religious rituals, and royal achievements. Yet what interests historians most in the context of the Hanging Gardens is not military power or monumental architecture, it is water. Again and again, the evidence from Nineveh reveals an obsession with controlling, transporting, and displaying water on an extraordinary scale. This becomes particularly significant when examining the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BC. Sennacherib was not merely a conqueror. Like many powerful rulers, he was also a builder. He transformed Nineveh through ambitious construction projects designed to elevate the city above all rivals. His inscriptions describe extensive efforts to reshape the surrounding landscape. Rivers were redirected, canals were excavated, water systems were expanded. The goal was not merely survival, the goal was abundance. Sennacherib wanted his capital to flourish with greenery, agriculture, and royal gardens unlike anything seen before. Suddenly, the story begins to sound familiar. The more researchers studied Sennacherib's inscriptions, the more intriguing the parallels became. In several texts, he boasts about creating extraordinary gardens supplied by sophisticated hydraulic systems. He describes bringing water across considerable distances. He celebrates engineering achievements that transformed the environment. He presents himself as a ruler capable of making difficult landscapes bloom. None of this proves the existence of the Hanging Gardens, yet the similarities are difficult to ignore. For the first time, historians found themselves looking at direct contemporary evidence describing royal gardens and advanced irrigation systems in terms that resembled elements of the later legend. Even more intriguing was the language Sennacherib used to describe some of his engineering works. In certain inscriptions, he portrays them as unprecedented achievements. He emphasizes innovation. He highlights technological solutions. He speaks not simply of construction, but of overcoming natural limitations. These themes echo the very qualities that later Greek and Roman writers admired in the Hanging Gardens. The connection becomes even stronger when archaeology enters the picture. Excavations around Nineveh have revealed evidence of one of the most ambitious water management systems of the ancient world. Networks of canals stretched across the landscape. Some extended for dozens of miles. Engineers constructed aqueducts to carry water across difficult terrain. The most famous of these, located at Jedwan, represents one of the earliest known large-scale stone aqueducts ever discovered. Massive blocks of stone formed channels capable of transporting enormous quantities of water toward the city. The engineering sophistication is striking even by modern standards. Suddenly, the question shifts. Instead of asking whether ancient Mesopotamian engineers could create the kind of hydraulic system described in accounts of the gardens, historians begin asking whether Nineveh already possessed exactly the sort of infrastructure such a project would require. Yet perhaps the most fascinating evidence comes from Assyrian art itself. Stone reliefs discovered in royal palaces depict lush landscapes filled with trees, terraces, flowing water, and carefully arranged vegetation. Some scenes appear almost dreamlike, presenting cultivated greenery on a scale rarely associated with the harsh environments of Mesopotamia. Scholars continue debating precisely what these images represent, but they demonstrate something important. The Assyrians were not merely capable of imagining grand gardens, they actively celebrated them. Gardens formed part of royal ideology. They symbolized order, prosperity, and mastery over nature. Kings displayed them as evidence of their power and sophistication. The parallels with later descriptions of the Hanging Gardens become increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet the theory becomes even more provocative when language enters the discussion. Ancient texts sometimes use the term Babylon in ways that can be confusing to modern readers. Empires shifted. Territories changed hands. Political terminology evolved. In certain contexts, titles and place names carried meanings that extended beyond strict geographical boundaries. Some researchers have suggested that later writers may have inherited traditions that gradually conflated different cities and rulers. Over centuries, details associated with Nineveh could potentially have become attached to Babylon, especially given Babylon's growing fame in the classical imagination. It is not difficult to see how such a process might occur. Stories tend to migrate toward famous names. Lesser-known figures are forgotten, while more famous ones absorb their achievements. Historical memory often behaves less like a precise archive and more like a river, reshaping itself as it flows through time. None of this means the case is closed. The Nineveh theory remains exactly that, a theory. Many historians find it compelling. Others remain cautious. Some argue that similarities between the evidence and later descriptions are significant. Others note that gaps still exist. Important questions remain unanswered. No inscription explicitly states that Sennacherib built what later generations called the Hanging Gardens. The evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. Yet what makes the theory so powerful is not that it solves every problem. It is that it explains several problems simultaneously. The silence of Babylonian records becomes less mysterious. the existence of advanced irrigation systems gains stronger support. The engineering challenge appears more manageable. The surviving artistic and textual evidence begins to align in unexpected ways. For perhaps the first time in centuries, the mystery acquires a plausible alternative framework. And that realization changes everything. The investigation is no longer confined to Babylon. The map itself has expanded. The search has moved beyond the city that gave the wonder its famous name and into a broader landscape of competing possibilities. The question is no longer whether the gardens existed. The question is where they existed. Somewhere between Babylon and Nineveh, between memory and evidence, between legend and history, the mystery enters an entirely new phase. Because if generations of scholars have indeed been searching the wrong city, then one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world may not be lost at all. It may simply be waiting for us in a place where we never thought to look. For more than 2,000 years, the Hanging Gardens seemed to belong to Babylon so completely that few people thought to separate the wonder from the city whose name it carried. Yet once the possibility emerged that the gardens might have stood elsewhere, the investigation changed dramatically. The question was no longer whether ancient engineers could create such a marvel. It was no longer whether later writers had preserved genuine memories of an extraordinary garden. The question became far more specific. If the gardens were not in Babylon, then where exactly were they? Among all the alternatives that have been proposed, one stands above the rest, not because it solves every problem, but because it aligns with an unusual number of clues at the same time. That place is Nineveh. What makes Nineveh fascinating is that it does not merely offer a different location. It offers an entirely different story. Instead of searching for evidence that never quite appears, researchers suddenly find themselves standing in a city where descriptions, engineering achievements, inscriptions, and visual imagery begin to converge in ways that feel surprisingly difficult to dismiss. Imagine approaching Nineveh during the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib at the beginning of the 7th century BC. The city stretched across a vast area near the Tigris River, protected by enormous walls and filled with palaces, temples, workshops, administrative buildings, and military installations. It was one of the largest urban centers on Earth. Tens of thousands of people lived within its boundaries. Traders arrived from distant lands. Soldiers marched through its gates. Royal officials managed the machinery of empire. Yet what distinguished Nineveh from many other ancient capitals was not simply its size. It was the king's determination to transform nature itself into a demonstration of power. Sennacherib was not content with walls and palaces alone. His inscriptions reveal a ruler obsessed with reshaping the landscape around his capital. Again and again, he describes water. He speaks of canals, reservoirs, irrigation systems, and engineering projects designed to bring life into areas that had previously struggled to sustain intensive cultivation. To modern readers, these passages can seem surprisingly technical. Unlike many royal inscriptions that focus primarily on military victories, some of Sennacherib's texts devote considerable attention to infrastructure. He wanted future generations to know not only that he conquered enemies, but that he transformed the physical world. One inscription in particular has attracted enormous attention from historians studying the Hanging Gardens mystery. In it, Sennacherib describes creating what some translations render as a kind of wonder for all peoples. He boasts about constructing gardens filled with exotic plants gathered from across his empire. Trees from distant mountains were transplanted into carefully managed landscapes. Water was transported across long distances to sustain them. The language is striking because it echoes themes that later appear in descriptions of the Hanging Gardens. The similarities do not provide definitive proof, but they create an uncomfortable question for traditional interpretations. Why does one of the strongest contemporary descriptions of monumental irrigated gardens come not from Babylon, but from Nineveh? The answer becomes even more intriguing when archaeology enters the discussion. Modern excavations and surveys have revealed the extraordinary scale of Sennacherib's water management system. This was not a simple network of irrigation ditches. It was one of the most ambitious hydraulic projects ever attempted in the ancient world. Engineers redirected rivers. They excavated canals through difficult terrain. They built aqueducts capable of carrying water across valleys and uneven landscapes. The most famous surviving example is the aqueduct at Jerwan, located northeast of Nineveh. Constructed from massive stone blocks, it represents one of the earliest known aqueduct systems on Earth. Looking at its remains today, one gains an appreciation for the confidence and technical skill of Assyrian engineers. They were not merely adapting to their environment, they were redesigning it. The existence of such infrastructure matters because it directly addresses one of the greatest challenges associated with the Hanging Gardens: water. Throughout the mystery, water has remained the central engineering obstacle. How could ancient builders lift enough water to sustain elevated gardens filled with large trees and dense vegetation? In Babylon, clear evidence for such a system remains elusive. Around Nineveh, however, evidence for large-scale hydraulic engineering is undeniable. The Assyrians demonstrated both the capability and the ambition required to move enormous quantities of water over significant distances. This does not automatically mean they built the Hanging Gardens. Yet it shifts the conversation from speculation toward possibility in a way few other sites can match. Perhaps the most visually compelling evidence comes from Assyrian palace reliefs. Carved into stone and preserved across centuries, these artworks provide rare glimpses into the world the Assyrian kings wanted to create. Among scenes of warfare and royal ceremony appear images of carefully designed landscapes. Trees rise above terraced terrain. Watercourses flow through cultivated spaces. Gardens spread across elevated settings. In some reliefs, the combination of terraces, vegetation, and hydraulic features feels remarkably similar to what later writers described. Historians remain cautious because artistic representations are not architectural blueprints. Ancient artists often idealized reality. Yet the imagery demonstrates something important. The concept of monumental royal gardens was not foreign to Assyrian culture. It was celebrated. It was displayed publicly. It formed part of the visual language of kingship itself. This realization creates one of the most intriguing moments in the entire mystery. For centuries, historians searched for evidence that matched the ancient descriptions. In Nineveh, they suddenly encounter a landscape where many of those elements appear together. Monumental gardens, advanced irrigation, massive engineering works, royal inscriptions celebrating environmental transformation. artistic depictions of lush terraces. The convergence is striking. Yet the story becomes even more complicated. One reason the Nineveh theory attracts attention is that it helps explain several long-standing puzzles simultaneously. The silence of Babylonian records becomes less troubling. The engineering challenge becomes more manageable. The existence of large royal gardens gains direct support from contemporary inscriptions. Even certain linguistic ambiguities in later sources begin to make more sense. In some ancient contexts, place names were not always used with modern precision. Political power shifted. Cities changed status. Imperial capitals rose and fell. Information passed through multiple languages and cultures before reaching Greek and Roman authors. Under such conditions, confusion was possible. A story originating in Nineveh could potentially migrate toward Babylon, especially as Babylon's fame expanded throughout the classical world. Yet despite all these strengths, the Nineveh theory remains a theory. Responsible historians continue to debate its implications. Some find the evidence highly persuasive. Others argue that important gaps remain. The archaeological record, while impressive, does not provide a single definitive discovery that settles the matter beyond dispute. No stone inscription explicitly announces, "These are the hanging gardens later described by Greek writers." Such clarity rarely exists in ancient history. Instead, researchers must weigh probabilities. They must evaluate patterns. They must determine whether the convergence of clues represents genuine historical connection or an elaborate coincidence. This uncertainty is precisely what keeps the mystery alive. If the evidence were weaker, the theory could be dismissed. If the evidence were stronger, the debate might already be over. Instead, historians occupy a middle ground where the clues are compelling enough to demand attention, but incomplete enough to invite disagreement. And perhaps that is what makes Nineveh so fascinating. It transforms the mystery from a story of absence into a story of possibility. Instead of asking why evidence cannot be found, we begin asking whether evidence has been hiding in plain sight under a different name. The city itself becomes a kind of mirror reflecting the entire investigation. Every canal, every inscription, every carved relief seems to whisper the same question. What if the wonder survived all along, not as a lost monument buried beneath Babylon, but as a forgotten memory attached to the wrong city? As the pieces continue to fall into place, the possibility becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The gardens described by later writers may never have belonged to Babylon at all. They may have flourished beneath the shadow of Assyrian palaces, nourished by one of the greatest hydraulic systems of the ancient world, admired by visitors whose stories gradually changed shape as they traveled through time. Whether this explanation ultimately proves correct remains uncertain. Yet by this stage of the investigation, Nineveh has become more than an alternative location. It has become a serious contender for one of history's most elusive wonders. And if the theory is even partially correct, then the greatest surprise of all may not be that the hanging gardens disappeared. The greatest surprise may be that humanity spent centuries looking at the evidence without realizing what it was seeing. After centuries of speculation, decades of excavation, thousands of translated inscriptions, and countless debates among historians, archaeologists, engineers, and linguists, we arrive at the question that has been waiting at the center of the mystery from the very beginning. Did the hanging gardens really exist? It is the kind of question that seems as though it should have a simple answer. Either they existed or they did not. Either a great artificial mountain of trees once rose above the ancient world, or it never stood at all. Yet the deeper one travels into the evidence, the more difficult such certainty becomes. The mystery of the Hanging Gardens refuses to fit neatly into categories of true or false. Instead, it occupies a far more fascinating territory where fragments of history, lost memories, ancient propaganda, engineering achievements, and centuries of storytelling intersect. Perhaps the most surprising conclusion is that the mystery itself reveals something profound about how history works. We often imagine the past as a fixed landscape waiting to be uncovered, as though every question possesses a definitive answer buried somewhere beneath the earth. In reality, history often resembles a shattered mirror. Some pieces survive intact, others disappear forever. What remains is enough to glimpse the original image, but not always enough to reconstruct it perfectly. The Hanging Gardens may be one of the clearest examples of this challenge in the entire ancient world. The evidence does not point cleanly toward a single conclusion. Instead, it points toward several possibilities, each supported by different pieces of the puzzle. The first possibility is the most traditional. The gardens existed in Babylon, much as later Greek and Roman writers described them. They were built during the Neo-Babylonian period, perhaps under Nebuchadnezzar II, and became one of the most admired monuments of antiquity. Over time, political upheaval, environmental change, warfare, flooding, rebuilding, and the passage of centuries erased their physical remains. The city itself suffered repeated cycles of destruction and decline. Materials were reused, structures collapsed, landscapes changed. Under this scenario, the silence of surviving Babylonian records may simply reflect the incompleteness of the historical archive. Important texts could have been lost. Relevant inscriptions may remain undiscovered. Archaeological evidence might still lie hidden beneath areas that have never been excavated. This explanation remains possible because history repeatedly reminds us how much evidence has vanished. Entire libraries disappeared, cities were abandoned, archives burned. Future discoveries may yet reveal information unavailable today. Yet the traditional theory faces significant challenges. The most obvious remains the absence of clear Babylonian references. The city left behind an enormous documentary record. Nebuchadnezzar proudly described many of his construction projects. The fact that no surviving inscription unambiguously celebrates the Hanging Gardens continues to trouble researchers. The problem is not fatal, but it is difficult to ignore. A second possibility has gained increasing attention over recent decades. The gardens existed, but not in Babylon. Instead, they flourished in Nineveh, under the Assyrian king Sennacherib. This theory possesses an unusual strength because it addresses several mysteries simultaneously. Contemporary Assyrian inscriptions describe extensive royal gardens. Archaeological evidence confirms the existence of vast irrigation systems and aqueducts. Palace reliefs depict cultivated landscapes that appear remarkably sophisticated. The engineering infrastructure required to support large-scale gardens unquestionably existed. Most importantly, the theory helps explain why Babylonian records remain silent. If the wonder belonged to another city, then historians may have been searching for evidence in the wrong place all along. Under this interpretation, later generations gradually transferred stories associated with Nineveh to Babylon, perhaps because Babylon became the more famous name within classical traditions. The idea sounds dramatic, Yet history contains many examples of similar confusion. Cities exchange reputations, legends migrate. Famous names absorb stories that originally belonged elsewhere. The passage of centuries can blur distinctions that once seemed obvious. Nevertheless, the Nineveh theory also leaves unanswered questions. While the evidence is compelling, it remains circumstantial. No surviving inscription directly states that Sennacherib built the monument later known as the Hanging Gardens. The connections are strong, but not definitive. Historians must therefore weigh probabilities rather than certainties. A third possibility occupies a middle ground between history and legend. Under this scenario, the gardens were inspired by real royal landscapes that existed somewhere within Mesopotamia, whether in Babylon, Nineveh, or perhaps multiple locations. Over time, memories of different gardens, engineering achievements, and royal building programs merged together into a single story. Ancient travelers encountered extraordinary irrigation systems. They saw terraces. They admired imported trees and cultivated landscapes. As these stories circulated through generations, separate observations gradually fused into one magnificent wonder. By the time Greek and Roman writers recorded the tradition, they may have inherited a narrative that contained genuine historical elements, but no longer reflected a single identifiable structure. This possibility is often overlooked because modern audiences tend to prefer clear answers. Yet it may align surprisingly well with how historical memory actually functions. Human beings are storytellers. We simplify, combine, and reshape information as it passes from one generation to another. Historical traditions frequently preserve authentic details while simultaneously transforming them. The resulting narrative becomes neither entirely factual nor entirely fictional. Instead, it becomes something more complicated, a cultural memory built from layers of reality accumulated over time. What makes the Hanging Gardens particularly fascinating is that all three possibilities remain plausible. None can be proven beyond doubt. None can be completely dismissed. This uncertainty frustrates some people because it prevents a definitive verdict. Yet uncertainty itself can be revealing. The inability to reach absolute certainty does not mean the investigation has failed. On the contrary, the investigation has already achieved something remarkable. It has transformed a famous legend into a sophisticated historical inquiry. Along the way, researchers uncovered forgotten engineering achievements, reconstructed ancient landscapes, translated long-lost inscriptions, and revealed the extraordinary capabilities of Mesopotamian civilizations. Even if the precise truth remains elusive, the search has expanded our understanding of the ancient world in profound ways. There is another reason the mystery continues to resonate. The Hanging Gardens challenge modern assumptions about fame and evidence. We often assume that the most famous things leave the strongest traces. Yet history does not always work that way. Some of the most influential ideas survive with surprisingly little physical evidence. Meanwhile, countless structures that once seemed important disappear almost completely. Fame and preservation are not the same thing. The Hanging Gardens may represent the ultimate example of this paradox. They became one of the most celebrated wonders in human history while remaining among the least certain. In a strange sense, the mystery itself became part of the monument. The wonder survived not through stone walls or surviving terraces, but through curiosity. Every generation inherited the question and passed it onward. Ancient travelers wondered about the gardens. Medieval scholars wondered about them. Modern archaeologists wonder about them. Future historians almost certainly will as well. The search has become part of the story. And perhaps that is why the mystery remains so powerful. Human beings are naturally drawn toward unanswered questions. A solved mystery eventually becomes a fact. An unsolved mystery remains alive. The Hanging Gardens have endured because they continue to occupy that rare space where evidence is substantial enough to inspire belief, yet incomplete enough to sustain doubt. We can almost see the terraces rising above the horizon. We can almost hear water moving through hidden channels. We can almost imagine trees casting shadows across elevated walkways while distant visitors gaze upward in astonishment. The image feels close enough to touch, yet never quite settles into certainty. As we stand at the end of this investigation, the most honest verdict may also be the most satisfying. The evidence suggests that extraordinary royal gardens almost certainly existed somewhere within the great civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia. Advanced irrigation systems unquestionably existed. Monumental engineering projects unquestionably existed. Ambitious rulers capable of reshaping entire landscapes unquestionably existed. What remains uncertain is whether those elements came together in exactly the way later generations imagined. The Hanging Gardens may have stood above Babylon. They may have flourished in Nineveh. They may have emerged from a blend of historical realities woven together by centuries of memory. For now, the final answer remains just beyond reach. And perhaps that is fitting. Because among all the wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens possess a unique distinction. The Great Pyramid survives as stone. The Colossus survives as memory. The lighthouse survives through descriptions. But the Hanging Gardens survive as something even more enduring. A question. A question that has crossed more than 2,000 years, challenged generations of scholars, and continues to remind us that the past is never entirely finished revealing its secrets. Thank you for joining me tonight on Sleep History Night. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysteries of the ancient world, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a peaceful night, and I'll